This video is about the rubber band effect. You can hear coaches talk about it in many sports like javelin throwing, tennis, golf, and disc golf. What they mean by that is that during the backward movement of the limb, you can load elastic energy into the body and then release it during the throw or the hit. But is the effect real? Is it actually possible to use the muscles and the tendons in the chest and the back and the abdomen like a bow and arrow in order to get faster forehands or longer drives in golf? In this video, I will explain why the phenomenon is actually real, but it doesn't apply to movements of the upper body like throwing or hitting. I will also explain why, despite of what I just said, it's actually good to stretch the muscle just before the actual move. I base the views of this video on my education. I have a PhD in biomechanics, and also I've talked about this phenomenon with many professors in this field. Let's start with the basics. The more scientific name for the rubber band effect is the stretch shortening cycle. So the working muscle, as the name suggests, stretches before shortening. What they usually mean by muscle is actually the muscle tendon complex. So it's the muscle and the tendon that's attached to the muscle. Like, for example, in the calf, it's the Achilles tendon attached to the soleus and gastrocnemius. So a muscle is like the force-producing engine, and the tendon is like a spring that sits between the muscle and the bone. The calf is actually the best example of using the rubber band effect. So, for example, when we're hopping on our toes, we get a stretch in the Achilles tendon when we come down, and that stored energy is then released during the next hop. This is useful in many ways. First of all, jumping by stretching the tendon is much more economical than if the same work was done by actually stretching and contracting the muscle. Also, the muscle can produce much more force when it doesn't have to change in length, when the length change is actually performed by the tendon. Calves have evolved to withstand thousands, if not tens of thousands of repetitions per day. When we were hunting for wild animals, not us, but our ancestors, they had to perform long chases where energy saving was a golden feature. And that's why we have the Achilles tendon, which really resembles a thick rubber band. The calf is actually even ingeniously divided into two main muscles. The gastrocnemius muscle, which has the longer tendon so that it can actually store the maximum amount of energy. And to the soleus, that has a shorter tendon that actually gives us better balance control. It's no coincidence that a kangaroo, whose Achilles tendon is twice as long as it is in humans, leans on its tail while it's standing. You just can't control forces with an elastic rubber band in the middle. So now that we have an idea of a muscle that's really good at storing elastic energy, we can wonder if the phenomenon also applies to the main muscle of the throwing or hitting movements. For example, the rotation of the body is mainly performed with oblique abdominal muscles. Those muscles do not have a rubber band like tendons. They actually have a connective membrane that covers the entire width of the abdomen. And these tissues are not actually suitable for stretching, but actually work as a supporting corset for the entire mid-body. That's logical because their use is also very different. You don't have to do large, forceful rotations of the middle body thousands of times a day. The same also applies to the pectoral muscles that spin the arm into motion in a forehand shot or a throw. And now let's get to the third part of this story. Why is it still beneficial to stretch the muscles involved in the throw before it's their turn to do their part? To understand this, let's take a look at the squat jump first. Basic physics say that the jumping height is determined by how fast the body was moving when it left the ground. So the muscles actually accelerate the body, and then the gravity brings us back to ground. Now let's compare two ways to do a squat jump. In the first one, you position yourself in a squat position and then start from this position to push yourself as high as possible. Muscles have a runway for the acceleration, just like a Top Gun jet on an aircraft carrier. It starts when you're in a squat position and it ends when the legs are straight and the toes leave the ground. Before the muscle produces its maximum force, a chain of chemical and physical reactions must take place. Neurotransmitters are released, cross bridges are formed. Also, the tendons must take away the slack. We won't go into details in this video. But because of those reactions, it takes almost a second to produce maximum force. But the jump, the push-off from the ground, actually doesn't even last half a second. And that means that when you leave the ground, the engine is actually still getting ready to produce full power. Fortunately, there's another way to jump. It's the so-called counter movement jump. In the counter movement jump, you start with your legs straight, go into squat, and immediately jump up towards the heavens. So what makes this tactic so ingenious? Well, it's the fact that the muscles that are pushing now start working much earlier. Because before the actual jump, they actually first have to break the opposite downward movement. This means that when the jumper is squatting in the beginning of the runway, and the actual effort begins, the engines are already almost at full power. This way, the entire upward acceleration can be done with greater muscle force. And the same is actually true for other muscles. By stretching the muscle just before an explosive performance, you get a much better force output from this engine. And anyone who remembers the formulas of physics knows that it leads to greater speed when jumping, throwing, or punching. So, the take-home message is, yes, it's better for the arm to pull back just before the throw or the hit, because it leads to better force production. And no, it has nothing to do with the rubber band.